In the forgotten annals of history, where ink has faded and parchment has turned to dust, there are stories that refuse to die. They linger in the cold stones of ruined castles and whisper on the wind that sweeps through desolate courtyards. This is one such tale, a story of a crown bought with blood, a queen who became a sacrifice, and a princess born into the heart of a storm. It is the story of the kingdom of Eldoria, a realm built on a dark promise and destined to drown in sorrow. We are told that power is the ultimate prize, but history teaches a more brutal lesson, that some thrones are not seats of glory but gilded tombs, and for those who dare to sit upon them the only legacy is tragedy. The tale of King Valerius and his bride is not a fairy tale of love, but a harrowing chronicle of how ambition becomes a curse, and how a crown can devour everything pure, leaving behind only shadows, silence, and the faint, heartbreaking echo of a queen's last tear. Before the blood, before the betrayal, there was only the shadow of a man and the hunger in his eyes. The kingdom of Eldoria was not born from noble lineage or divine right. It was carved from the flesh of a dying dynasty by a warlord named Valerius. The air in his court never felt settled. It was thick with the ghosts of those he had crushed to ascend, and the whispers that followed him were not of admiration, but of fear. They said he had made a pact with forgotten gods in the mountain's shadow, trading his soul for a throne. They spoke of a curse that clung to his bloodline, a prophecy that any light brought into his life would be violently extinguished. In these early days, the palace was a place of cold grandeur, its vast halls echoing with the solitary footsteps of a king who trusted no one. The tapestries depicted glorious battles, but the threads seemed woven with sorrow. The king, the court, the very stones of the castle, all were waiting. They were waiting for a queen, a bride to legitimize the blood-soaked crown. They were waiting for the next act of a tragedy that had already been written in the stars, long before the players even knew their roles. Valerius was not born a king. He was a tempest, a force of nature that tore through the old world. He rose from the dirt and grime of the borderlands, a man with no inheritance but a sword arm and an unquenchable thirst for power. He gathered legions of the desperate and the damned, promising them glory and gold, and they followed him through fire and chaos. He was a brilliant strategist, but his true genius lay in his cruelty. He understood that fear was a more potent weapon than any blade. He burned cities that defied him, turning their walls to ash and their fields to salt, ensuring that his name became a synonym for ruin. When he finally stormed the capital, the old king was found dead, not by Valerius's sword, but by a poisoned chalice, a quiet, insidious end that spoke volumes of the new ruler's methods. Valerius took the throne not with the cheers of the people, but amidst their terrified silence. He was King Valerius, the Shadow Wolf, a ruler whose crown was cemented not with honor, but with the blood and bones of his rivals. This was the man who would soon seek a bride, a king whose foundation was built upon a graveyard of ambition. To solidify his reign, King Valerius needed more than fear, he needed legitimacy. He found it in Queen Seraphina. She was a princess from a distant, sun-drenched kingdom, famed for her wisdom, compassion, and breathtaking beauty. Their marriage was a political masterpiece. Her noble bloodline would wash away the stench of his violent ascent. When she arrived in Eldoria, it was as if the sun had broken through the perpetual gray clouds that hung over the capital. Her smile was genuine, her grace effortless. The people, starved for warmth and kindness, fell in love with her instantly. She was everything their new king was not, gentle where he was harsh, merciful where he was cruel. For a fleeting moment there was hope. Perhaps her light could temper his darkness. Perhaps this bride could break the curse that clung to the king. But as she walked down the aisle of the grand cathedral, she did not see the adoration in the crowd. She only saw the cold, possessive glint in King Valerius's eyes. She was not his partner. She was his most prized possession, the beautiful, fragile key to securing his dark legacy. A year later, the kingdom rejoiced. Queen Seraphina gave birth to a daughter, Princess Lyra. She was a perfect child, with her mother's gentle eyes and a spirit that seemed untouched by the palace's suffocating gloom. To the people, she was a symbol of a brighter future, a promise that the union of the Shadow Wolf and the Sun Queen could create something pure. For Queen Seraphina, the princess became her entire world, a reason to endure the cold halls and her husband's ever-growing paranoia. She would shield her daughter from the darkness that festered within the sea, or raising her on stories of courage and kindness, not of conquest and fear. But King Valerius saw his daughter through a different lens. To him, Princess Lyra was not a child to be loved, but a political tool to be wielded. She was a bloodline, a bargaining chip, another piece on the great board of power he was playing. While the queen cradled her in love, the king was already calculating which foreign prince would pay the highest price for her hand. The birth of the princess was not the beginning of a new chapter, but merely the introduction of a new, innocent victim into the unfolding tragedy. Hope in a place like Eldoria was a dangerous thing. The queen's popularity with the people began to curdle into a source of poison within the palace walls. The king, a man who had earned his power through fear, could not comprehend the love his subjects felt for Queen Seraphina. He began to see her kindness not as a virtue, but as a threat. His council, filled with sycophants and schemers who thrived in his shadow, fed his paranoia. They whispered that the queen's gentle nature was a mask for cunning, that she was building her own base of power to one day usurp him. Every charity she founded, every kind word she spoke to a commoner, was twisted into an act of sedition. The palace, once just cold, now became suffocating. Shadows seemed to lengthen in the corridors, and every conversation felt like a conspiracy. The queen felt the change acutely. The warmth in her husband's eyes was replaced by a chilling suspicion. He was the cursed king, and his curse was an inability to trust anything he could not control, including the woman who was his wife and the mother of his only child, the innocent princess. A crown does not quench ambition, it feeds it. King Valerius, secure on his throne, now looked beyond his borders. He dreamed of an empire, an Eldoria whose name would be feared across the continent. This dream required gold, and that gold was bled from his own people. He levied crippling taxes, seized land, and conscripted young men into his ever-growing armies. The whispers of fear in his court turned into murmurs of dissent in the streets. But the king was deaf to their suffering, blinded by his lust for more. He saw his people not as subjects to be protected, but as resources to be exploited for his grand design. Queen Seraphina, horrified by his cruelty, tried to intervene. She pleaded with him for mercy, reminding him of his duty to the kingdom they ruled together. Her pleas, however, were seen as weakness, as an obstacle to his glorious destiny. He silenced her, confining her influence to the royal chambers, effectively making her a prisoner in her own home. The king's ambition was no longer just a drive for power. It had become a consuming fire, and it was beginning to burn his own kingdom to the ground. Behind the marble facade of royalty, Queen Seraphina was suffocating. Her life had become a gilded cage, each day a performance of serene compliance for a court that watched her every move. At night, when the palace was still, the facade would crumble. She would weep for the kingdom she had come to love, and for the people her husband was crushing under his heel. Her marriage to the king was a cold, empty ritual, devoid of the warmth she had once hoped for. She was isolated, her friends from her homeland sent away, her ladies-in-waiting replaced with spies loyal to the king. Her only solace was her daughter, the sweet Princess Lyra, whom she tried desperately to shield from the palace's toxic atmosphere. But a mother's love could not build a wall high enough to keep out the king's darkness. Desperate and alone, the queen began to take risks. She started using her private funds to smuggle food to the starving, communicating in secret with the few honorable men left in the royal guard, hoping to alleviate some of the suffering. These were small acts of rebellion, born not of a desire for power, but of a heart that refused to turn to stone. They were also acts that would seal her doom. Princess Lyra grew up in a world of beautiful contradictions. She wore gowns of the finest silk but felt the chill of the stone walls. She ate from golden plates but tasted the fear in the air. Her mother, the queen, filled her days with stories of light and heroes, while her father, the king, was a distant, intimidating thunderclouds she learned to avoid. The princess was a ghost in her own home, a silent observer of the growing chasm between her parents. She would see her mother's tear-stained face in the mornings and hear her father's enraged shouts echoing from the council chambers at night. She was too young to understand the politics, the betrayals, the depth of the rot that had infested her family and her kingdom. All she knew was the pervasive sadness that clung to her mother like a shroud. She was the hope of the kingdom, the heir to the throne, yet her destiny was as fragile as a bird's wing. The king had already begun negotiations to marry her off to the cruel prince of a northern empire in exchange for military might. The princess, a symbol of innocence, was fated to be the final, tragic sacrifice on the altar of her father's ambition. In her profound loneliness, Queen Seraphina found a single, dangerous comfort. It was not a passionate affair born of lust, but a quiet, desperate connection with Sir Caelan, the captain of the royal guard. He was one of the few who still remembered the meaning of honor, a man who saw the queen not as a political symbol, but as a suffering woman. He listened to her fears, shared in her sorrow for the kingdom, and became her secret confidant in her efforts to help the poor. Their meetings in the palace gardens and hidden chapels were chaste, filled with whispered conversations and shared grief. But in a court built on suspicion, perception is reality. A spy, loyal to the king's most venomous advisor, saw their hushed intimacy and twisted it into a tale of treason and adultery. When the rumor was delivered to King Valerius, it was the perfect weapon he had been waiting for. It was the justification for everything. The rage he unleashed was not that of a betrayed husband, but of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. The forbidden secret, a bond of shared sorrow, was about to become the spark that would burn the entire kingdom down. The king did not confront the queen in private. He chose the stage of the grand hall in front of the entire court. He accused her of treason, of adultery, of conspiring to overthrow him with her lover, Sir Caelan. The captain was dragged forth in chains, tortured into a false confession before being executed on the spot. The queen, pale but defiant, denied the accusations, but her voice was drowned out by the king's orchestrated outrage. He used the scandal to unleash a bloody purge, imprisoning or executing anyone suspected of loyalty to the queen. But he had miscalculated. The people, who loved their queen and despised their king, did not see a traitor. They saw a tyrant destroying the only good thing in their kingdom. The execution of Sir Caelan was the final straw. What began as riots in the city streets erupted into a full-scale civil war. Banners loyal to the memory of Queen Seraphina were raised across the land. The kingdom Valerius had built with fear was now collapsing under the weight of his own cruelty. The throne of Eldoria began to crack, and the halls of the palace filled with the sounds of battle and the screams of the dying. King Valerius knew he was losing control of his kingdom. In a desperate, final act of cruelty designed to break the rebellion's spirit, he condemned his own wife to death. Queen Seraphina was not given the mercy of a swift end. She was publicly humiliated, stripped of her titles, and dragged through the very streets where people once threw flowers at her feet. As she stood on the scaffold, she did not beg for her life. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching not for a savior but for one last glimpse of her daughter, the princess who had been locked away in a high tower. She spoke her final words, not of hate for the king, but of love for the people of Eldoria and a prayer for her child's safety. Her death was a brutal, agonizing spectacle, but instead of crushing the rebellion, it galvanized it. The tragic end of the beloved Queen Seraphina became a rallying cry for justice. The king, in trying to extinguish the last light of hope, had instead turned her into a martyr. Her death marked the true end of his reign, for he had now become a monster in the eyes of everyone, a cursed king who had devoured his own bride. With the queen dead, the moral authority of King Valerius shattered completely. His armies, already stretched thin and filled with conscripts who hated him, began to desert in droves. The rebel forces, fueled by righteous fury over the queen's murder, stormed the capital. The battle for the palace was short and savage. The king's loyalists, the very men who had whispered poison in his ear, were the first to abandon him, attempting to flee with stolen treasures. In the end, King Valerius was cornered, not on a glorious battlefield but in his own throne room, the symbol of his all-consuming ambition. He fought like the cornered wolf he was, but he was overwhelmed. He did not die a king's death. He was cut down by the swords of his own former soldiers, his body left to bleed out on the cold marble floor at the foot of the throne he had sacrificed everything for. His reign, which began in blood and shadow, ended the same way. The curse was complete. The crown lay on the floor, tarnished and splattered with the blood of the man who wore it, a hollow testament to the ruinous price of power. In the chaos that followed the king's death, as new lords scrambled for power and a new order was forged from the ashes of the old, the fate of Princess Lyra became a footnote, a loose thread in a bloody tapestry. What happened? To the innocent girl, the daughter of the cursed king and the martyred queen. Some say the new rulers, fearing her claim to the throne, had her quietly smothered in her sleep, her body buried in an unmarked grave beneath the castle walls. A tragic end for the princess who was born to be a pawn. Others whisper a more haunting tale, that in the confusion she was spirited away by a loyal servant and sold into a life of obscurity, forever unaware of her royal blood, her identity lost to time. The most sorrowful legend, however, claims she was simply forgotten. Left locked in her tower room, she wasted away, her calls for help never answered, her existence fading until she was nothing more than a ghost haunting the silent, empty palace. Whatever the truth, Princess Lyra vanished from history. She became a story told to frighten children, the princess who disappeared at dawn, her fragile destiny consumed by the very throne she was meant to inherit. The civil war ended, but Eldoria never recovered. The kingdom fractured, its lands carved up by petty lords who continued the cycle of greed and violence that King Valerius had perfected. The grand palace, the site of so much ambition and so much pain, was abandoned. Its treasures were looted, its halls fell silent, and nature began the slow, patient process of reclaiming the stone. The names of the king, the queen, and the princess were spoken less and less, eventually becoming the stuff of myth. Their story became a cautionary tale, a dark fable about the poison of unchecked power. The throne room became a place of sorrowful pilgrimage for the few who remembered, a place where the air was still heavy with the weight of unshed tears. The kingdom of Eldoria was no more. It was a scar on the map, a testament to the fact that a house built on a foundation of betrayal and blood cannot stand. All that remained was the silence, a profound, aching silence where a kingdom once roared, a silence filled with the ghosts of a cursed king, a murdered queen, and a lost princess. Power is a relentless tide that pulls all who seek it into its depths. The story of King Valerius is not unique. It is a timeless, brutal echo that reverberates through the corridors of history. It reminds us that ambition, when untethered from compassion, becomes a monster that devours not only its enemies but also its most precious treasures. The king sought an empire but built a graveyard. The queen arrived as a symbol of hope but became a martyr for a lost cause. And the princess, who should have been the future, became a forgotten ghost. Their tragedy lies not just in their deaths but in the grim certainty of their fate. The curse was not a supernatural force. It was the darkness that resides within the human heart, the greed that eclipses love, and the paranoia that suffocates all light. Their magnificent palace is now a tomb, their story a warning. For every shining crown there is a shadow, and for every throne a price must be paid in blood and sorrow. History bleeds, and its echoes are written in the cries of kings, queens, and lost princesses. This was the Fear Room. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more dark history tales.